When we talk when we talk about natural law in the sense that the scholastic theologians and philosophers developed natural law, we have to realize they're thinking about something very different than we might think of when we hear natural law. When we hear natural law, we might think, on one hand, about the idea of a law of nature, something like gravity that we have observed through repeated clinical trials in a laboratory that help us determine how natural forces react. We might also fall into the Enlightenment era trap of assuming that natural law means the same type of scientific evaluation of data applied to human beings. That there is some way to look at a lot of people over time and read off a moral rule book accessible through reason that should be discernible to everybody. Basically, this attitude is the result of Enlightenment era philosophers and theologians thinking that we had to have the same type of scientific methodology applied to morality and theology as they saw being developed around them in the labs. In the new scientific revolution they were all living through. This is very different from the approach that scholastics take to natural law, and the approach that the Christian tradition historically has taken. So when scholastics looked at natural law, they were trying to syncretize several important sources, sources that they thought provided key insights, and figuring out how to align those together. So the first source, of course, is Scripture. And in talking about natural law, I want to argue that scholastics are really trying to find a way to hold Romans 2 and Romans 7 together. So in Romans 2, as we've talked about, the really important paragraph is right here in verses 14 and 15. Indeed, when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witnesses, and their thoughts sometimes in accusing them and at other times defending them. So we can see in this passage this sense that there are rules that bind everybody, but that everyone can share to a certain degree in a sense of what is right and wrong, that there is something our consciences implanted. Well, there's two things. We have our consciences bearing witness, and there are requirements of God's law that are written on people's hearts, that speak to their lives, that direct them in what to do. This approach of Paul, if we are reading Paul as a Jewish rabbi, which I hope we are, picks up on ideas from the Old Testament as well, specifically stories of righteous Gentiles, the sense that the prophets have that people are guilty before God for violating certain basic moral rules, particularly relating to care of the poor and the vulnerable, and that the people outside the nation of Israel are just as guilty and will be punished by God. So we have this one type of strand of biblical reflection that's incredibly important for thinking about natural law. On the other hand, in contrast, in this very same book by Paul, we have a different take of the law. And we find this specifically in Romans 7:14 through 15. The law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. So what scholastic theologians were faced with was the task of reconciling these very different statements about our nature, our ability to discern the good, and our ability to do the good, captured in the Apostle Paul. They also have another important source outside of Scripture, and this source for them is Roman legal theory. As the scholastics became part of the endeavor to rebuild Europe in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire, they were looking for any type of religious or secular resource they could find that could provide guidance. And the Roman legal codes became incredibly important in this process. They were never valued as high as Scripture, but they did think that they had important insights. These included, most importantly, the Code of Justinian, but also the legal commentaries by philosophers such as Ulpian. And what they found in these legal codes was really interesting. They found statements that echoed the statements that Paul makes about a natural law, a law that lives within people, that directs their processes, that explains why you can expect things, the same moral standards of different people who live across the Roman Empire. So they're drawing on these sources as well. And these become incredibly important for shaping their thoughts. So they're trying to reconcile this sense of our total sinfulness, our brokenness, our inability to perhaps discern the good, definitely to do the good, and this sense they have from both theological sources that we saw in Romans 2 and secular sources, that there are some sort of basic moral directions that people receive. So what do they do with this? So let's turn to Thomas Aquinas and see how Thomas attempts to hold these different scriptural ideas and these secular ideas together. But first, I want to give you all a little primer if you haven't had it, or a reminder if you have, of the easiest way to read the Summa. I think if you haven't started doing it this way, this will really simplify our assignments going forward that involve readings from the Summa. So if you look at the Summa Theologica, you will see that Aquinas has divided it, as we can see here, into three primary parts. The first part is the doctrine of God, the doctrine of humans. The second part is divided by itself into two parts. We have the prima secunda pars and the secunda pars, so the first part of the second part and the second part of the second part. And this section is the section that is habitually used in moral theology. As you can see, it engages with the virtues here, and questions about the appropriate end of humans, acts, passions, law, and grace. And then in the third part, we arrive at his Christology, the life of Christ, and the role of the sacraments. He didn't get through all the sacraments before his death. The supplementum is reconstructed from his notes and by his students, and tries to follow and fill in the sacraments and the question of the resurrection and the last things, the parts he wasn't able to finish. So to read about the natural law, we will go to the prima part of the secunda partis and go down here to law. So remember that the Summa, remember that the mode of intellectual engagement in this time in the University of Paris was the disputatio, the debate, that you didn't write a dissertation to establish your academic credentials the way we do now. Rather, you would go and you would stand in the Great Hall at the University of Paris and you would answer challenging questions that people threw at you. And what they wanted to see is how are you able to engage both with Scripture as well as the authoritative, both secular and theological sources, to draw on them and also engage in your own independent critical reasoning to answer the questions. So the Summa, which is an introductory theological textbook, is set up the way one of these debates would be set up. So if you keep in mind that this is in a debate format, I think that already helps to make it easier. So we have the question. The question 94 is the natural law. So we go on to Article 1, and the topic has been set, and somebody proposes for the person engaging in the debate the question whether the natural law is a habit. At this point, our natural reaction would be to go on to Objection 1. This is not the way that Aquinas intended us to read this, and of course, not the way a debate would actually unfold. So what you want to do is you want to skip down to where it says, on the contrary, in Latin, the sed contra. And here, Aquinas is going to give us what he thinks is the guiding authoritative text or source for making his argument. So we see here, on the contrary, we have a quote from Augustine, and this seems to establish that the natural law cannot be a habit, because we know that the natural law is in infants and in the damned, both groups that are incapable of acting by the natural law. So he's got to so we have whether the natural law is a habit. We have an apparent. We have a we have to listen to Augustine. So we have an authoritative statement, and then we go down to the next part, the I answer that, which is called either the respondeo, I answer that, or the corpus. And this is where Aquinas is going to do his theological work. So how is he going to answer the question? How is he going to answer this question? He's got this authoritative citation from Augustine that he has to engage with. And so he distinguishes. He says, I answer that a thing may be called a habit in two ways. So he provides two different ways in which the natural law can be considered, or two different ways in which a habit might be defined. One does not apply to the natural law. The natural law cannot be a habit properly and essentially. So he's respected the statement from Augustine, but he provides the distinction. A habit may be applied to that which we hold by habit. So this gives us a way to say that in certain ways, the natural law is a habit. How he actually works it out is not as important for our point right now. So the person engaged in the debate has answered the question, but wait, someone has an objection. Someone thinks there's a problem with his argument. And at this point, we go back up to Objection 1. So we have, it would seem that the natural law is a habit, because as philosophers, as always Aristotle says, there are three things in the souls: power, habit, and passions. But the natural law is not a power, nor is it a passion, so it has to be a habit. Okay, so he's made this argument, he's accommodated Augustine, but someone just throws Aristotle at him in this objection. So you go back up to Objection 1, and then you scroll back down and look at the reply to Objection 1. So how is he going to deal with this objection? Objection 2, here we have Basil. And how's he going to apply to Basil? So he distinguishes, and then the same to Objection 3. So this is the easiest and most effective way for you to learn how to read the Summa. Start with figure out the topic, look at the specific question. Each article is going to have its own question. Question, the sed contra, the authoritative text, the corpus or the respondio, how he answers it, and then work your way through the objections one by one. Hopefully, reading it this way is going to really simplify your understanding. Then it will also make it easier for you to really focus on what are the parts of the arguments that you don't understand, and what, without getting lost in the structure, which just is very different and strange from the way that we normally read it. In the next section of the lecture, I will talk more about the actual content of what Aquinas is doing in this question. I'll provide a high-level overview, zero in on some key points, and then our discussion, if you want to, we can talk about it at greater depth.